I've got questions for Arden and for Asghar. So my question for you, Arden, is this: is that you started your analysis with a scenario of a minimum at 2,500 a month, and you said that affected 30% of the workforce, or paid or sort of waged workers, and then your scenarios went up to 60-something% of the of waged workers. Now this morning, Alan Manning told us that in the UK, 5% of workers are covered by the national minimum wage directly. And I suspect that if we look around most of the other OECD countries, we'll find that the proportion of workers being covered by the national minimum is always a lot lower than 30%. So my first question to you is, why did you start your analysis at 30%, at a threshold that covered 30% of the workforce, rather than follow the lead of say, Britain or Alan was suggesting, of looking at actually much lower thresholds, where you're really providing a floor, a minimum wage floor to stop ultra-exploitation? So that's the first question. The second question for you, if I might, is we know that when it comes to the effects of minimum wages, two of the big issues are going to be whether obviously employment elasticities, and they're going to vary between tradable and non-tradable sectors. Did you look at all about how the breakdown of workers covered by your different scenarios divide between tradable and non-tradable sectors? And also size of employer, because we know that in practice, the current system of of minimum enforcement really is it's much better at targeting white, Chinese, Indian employers, and by and large, inspectors avoid targeting black employers. And the most obvious sector of this is the taxi sector, where inspectors don't do any enforcement at all. Now, we'd want to know, if we want to know about actually how a minimum wage is likely to be enforced, or at least what is politically viable in terms of enforcement, I assume we would want to know a lot more about the size of the employer and actually the race of the employer. And we can't just wash race out of the picture here. Right? If we're talking about small black employers, it's going to be extremely difficult for the state to enforce a minimum wage on those employers. Right. So I've got a question. Can I ask a question of Asghar? Or shall I hold it?
Okay, you can ask the question.
So my question for you, Asghar, is this: is that those of us who are not specialist economic modelers, regard most economic modeling with a considerable dose of skepticism, for the reasons that you said at the beginning, which is that what you get out is largely dependent on what you put in. And so you've got criticisms of the Treasury model, which I think are probably quite right, that many of the Treasury model's findings result from the assumptions that they're making at the design stage. But this is presumably true for you as well, that many of your findings are the result of the assumptions you're making at the design stage. And it strikes me that there are a number of your findings which raise questions about the plausibility of some of your assumptions. So, for example, you have rising productivity with declining investment, right? Which is sort of counterintuitive. You've got rising exports in your various scenarios, which is very seriously counterintuitive, I think, for most of us. It certainly belies the economic history of the last 20 years, when rising wages have devastated all sorts of export sectors. You've got declining poverty, although there is no rise in employment and no significant fall in unemployment. Now that's the size of your decline in poverty strikes me as being really implausible for the reason I think Gilad gave. If half poor households have got no working members, it's unclear to me how you get those poverty declines if you have no rise in employment.
Okay, I've got a question at the front. And then I think we'll just take responses and rather go back for another round of questions thereafter.
I'm Phineas Malapela from Bosa. Basically, my question partly related to the very same question which has been asked. taking into account that South Africa is dominated by multinationals in terms of economy, and then all government institutions are afraid of the multinational because they always cite that investment will run away from the country, the investment which are not even coming, even if they don't. So will we be able, or there is any international best example which the panelists can be able to give us, which was done in other countries to enforce this minimum wage? Thank you.
Thank you. Arden, do you want to respond first? Yeah.
Cool. So let me respond to Jeremy's two questions. The first question was why start at 2,500, given that nearly a third of workers are covered at that level. And I'll say the range of 2,500 to 6,000 was something that sort of was calibrated after presenting in about 6 or 7 different fora last year, ranging from NEDLAC to the press, to WITS, to the Employment Conditions Commission. So that range sort of covered what I felt was a reasonable interval that was sort of being bandied around the debate at the time. Whether that's accurate or not is up for question, but that was a sort of a judgment call that I made after a lot of consultation. The question of why starting at 2,500 if it covers that many people, and why not sort of take the opposite approach and say, well, in the UK, as you cited, 5% are covered, or in certain scenarios, 10 to 15% indirectly, as you saw from Alan earlier this morning. And the reason for that, I mean, there's many reasons, but the two major reasons that I can think of is first of all, the minimum sectorally determined wage. The lowest of them is around about 2,500. So, I mean, I'm not going to start proposing a national minimum, or not proposing, not going to start analyzing the potential coverage of a national minimum wage that's below the current lowest sectoral average in 2015. So I didn't think that would add too much to the debate. And the fact that that the lowest, or the low scenario covers almost a third of workers is driven precisely by the problem that we're trying to address. And that is that there's an incredibly large mass of workers on the left-hand side of the distribution in South Africa compared to, say, an OECD country. And it is precisely because of the distribution of wages that we have such a large mass at the bottom, and that such a small, relatively small amount covers such a relatively large portion of the labor force. I mean, if I were to choose a figure of, let's be generous and say that covers 10% of the population, we're talking about wages that are just too low that not even some of our friends at the debating table would even consider going that low. So I think so the reason for choosing that lower bound was driven partly by the lowest sectorally determined wage, and also driven by necessity by the distribution of earnings itself. The second question, which I thought was an interesting one, about the taking into account the different elasticities or the wage elasticity of labor demand in different tradable versus non-tradable sectors, and then leading on from that, considering the size of employers and the particular characteristics of the employers, I would say the analysis using the QLFS does not go into tradables and non-tradables. That's certainly something that could have been done. I'll accept that, and given that the difference between the two may be something that is interesting. On the second point of looking at the different employers, I mean, the obvious choice, if we wanted to do that, would turn from the quarterly labor force survey to the quarterly employment statistics survey, so the difference, just very briefly, between the two is that the QLFS will interview workers directly and ask them what is their pay before taxes, so it's a gross measure. And the QES will basically go to employers and say, what did you pay your workers? So there's a lot of debate in the literature, in South African literature at the moment, about why there's a difference between wages as measured in one data set versus measured in another data set. If we wanted the characteristics, of the employer, we would go to the QES. The trade-off, though, is that when we go to the QES, we're only dealing with certain subsection of the labor market. We're only dealing with formal employment, and we're only dealing with firms that have a turnover of R1 million or more per year. So almost by definition, we're cutting out a lot of workers who are at the left-hand part of the distribution. We're cutting out a lot of the workers who are earning very low wages. And in the discussions that led up to the production of this paper, it was decided that we would use the quarterly labour force survey because we felt it gave a better coverage of the total labour market in general and of the lower end of the labour market, of the lower end of earnings in particular. And although the trade-off is there that we can't link employers' characteristics to the wages, we feel that it did a much better job of capturing the part of the earnings distribution that we felt would be most affected by the potential application of the national minimum wage.
Unfortunately, I'm not equipped to answer the question that you raised. Don't have the expertise for that. But I have a couple of things to say about what Jeremy said. Do you hear me? Hello? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I think if I didn't know you and somebody says, models are what you put in and what you take out, well, I think that's unfair, given that what you have written yourself about models and have been a lot of time uncritical about, for example, the national minimum wage analysis that you provided, the summarizing, without raising any questions about the assumptions made. And you yourself, for example, what is an assumption in a model? Assuming that elasticity of wage elasticity is 0.3 or 0.5 or 0.7 in the economy without any statistical analysis is an assumption going in the model. What I said in here is that for all our elasticities, we have done time series analysis. We have estimated them. So we have avoided completely that route of using elasticities of whether it's educated guess or whether it's somebody else or from another country or cross-country analysis. So that, I think, is something that I mentioned at the beginning, is that first understanding that we have the model looks at both demand, supply, and distribution, and each of these are captured through time series analysis, meaning that all the sensitivities that we have picked up, all the elasticities, are through a statistical analysis. In other words, they have a statistical backing, rather than believe me or just let's take a few numbers and then somehow apply it to all sectors of the economy, which is very unclear most of the time when you're reading some of those analyses that are done at different places. So I think it is, it's easy to say, well, models are what you put in, but I try to explain that what we're putting in the model is actually we have gone through extensive amount of work to do the estimations. It is a unique model. It has the number of estimation. If you look at the bottom-up side of the model, where an investment side, on employment and wages, we have estimated 45 wage equation, real wage equation from 1970 all the way to 2000. The latest estimation we did 2014. Co-integration technique. Any of you who have done some of that work, you know how long it takes to do that kind of work, because we wanted to capture the working of the economy, the laws of motion of this economy, the best technically possible. It would have been easy to assume some elasticities and a range of elasticities, and it is wrong actually methodologically. Even those who do it, it doesn't work. Every time you use different elasticities, you have to recalibrate your CGE model. And you look at any of the papers that you have yourself summarized or others who do the CGE, none of them says we use different elasticities and we went back, recalibrated the whole thing, which means completely a different model, and then here are the results. As if like you can just throw different elasticities into the model and run the model. So this is not a model that we built for this project. This is a model that we have built from 2000. We have built it 2006. We put it on the website. So we have updated it. So it's it's personal. It's a lot of work has gone into it, and I like it to be understood. In terms of, you said that we're showing a raising productivity, declining investment. investment is not declining. Actually, the first graph was to show that under all the scenarios, investment are rising. The pace of growth is different from the base scenario to the other scenario. It's lower pace than this, but it is rising. The investment is not declining. So that was the first graph that I put there. In terms of the, and I tried to explain the productivity in investment. I mean, we have been talking in South Africa about changing the capital-labor ratio in the country, making economy more labor-intensive, changing that whole pattern. What I tried to explain is that this increase in productivity that is coming out of which is the literature is in terms of the minimum wage helping increase in labor productivity, helps the producers to look at the expansion, whether, for example, here is we have expansion of demand, incomes are going up, increased demand for output, whether producers are looking at expanding output through investment, right away getting more capital stock, or to using the more efficient production, expanding production. So that is the angle that I was trying to also put out, because when you have not only the labor productivity goes up, capital productivity also is going up with projecting, and the combination of the two, a simple mathematical relationship, shows that it means also the capital labor ratio is going down. Now we should look at that. If that is a possibility in the debates in here, this is also something that has been desirable in South Africa. What can we do to reduce capital labor ratio in production? And that's what I was rushing. I was trying to go through this thing fast, but that is the angle that I was also trying to. In terms of poverty and employment, and I think that is also yes, employment through wage helps poverty. Employment doesn't bring poverty down. Employment, if it pays low wage, that's what we have, 50% unemployment. We have 40% or about 4 million or so of the workers, full-time workers, making less than 3,000 rand a month. So employment is not poverty reduction. That's why we're talking about the national minimum wage. So what we showed here is that actually the poverty rate goes down by about 1% to 3%. It is the bottom quintile, which are the main beneficiary of the national minimum wage, whose poverty goes down significantly. The top quintile was about 19% or so for 2015, didn't change much. And the overall poverty rate was only between 2%, 3%, 1.5%, depending on the scenario, went down. So it's also, we have to understand that context, and I think it's not correct to say that it is employment, and now if employment is going down, or employment relative to, to the base scenario. Also, employment in agriculture, employment in manufacturing, especially manufacturing, goes up. One of the things that happens in manufacturing is that, I think Arden shows that also, it's related to something he showed. Because the wages are higher, average wages are relatively higher, the national minimum wage does not have as much negative effect on some of the manufacturing sector as, for example, service or in agriculture sector. So they reap the benefit of the rising demand, increasing their output, rather than being affected by the negative employment or negative investment or any of that, less affected. So we see the manufacturing seems to be a beneficiary. What we're showing is the beneficiary, partly because of they are the net effect of positive and negative effects are more on the positive side for manufacturing than, for example, the service sector, which on the one hand demand for services goes up because of income going up, but also the higher wages has a supply side negative effect, and the net effect end up being positive output but a small negative employment effect. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to respond to the enforcement question? I'd like to.
It's not my area at all, but I'll take a stab at it. I just 2 points about that. I have no doubt that the inspector sort of framework in South Africa is highly complicated, probably highly biased. 2 things to say. First is that Ben and Haroon and colleagues have sort of published as part of a recent paper, sorry if I get it wrong, Ben, index of violation, which is a sort of way to measure both the incidence and depth of wage shortfalls based on sectoral or minimum wages. And just to say that it's something that probably should be a part of the debate about the national minimum wage, but that it is something that we can measure, and there is a framework for it. The second thing, though, is Martin Wittenberg has sort of done probably what most of you would consider the most comprehensive analysis of real wages over time in South Africa. And within what he considers quite a gloomy story based on what we would have expected 20 years ago, especially at the bottom end of the distribution, he finds a small positive story amongst the poorest workers, which he attributes to compliance with minimum wage in, for example, the domestic worker sector, which is, I think most people would agree, one of the sectors where inspectors have the least sort of traction. So, I mean, I've sort of seen people challenge him in seminars, sort of suggesting, you know, what would he sort of explain this, given the lack of compliance and enforcement in this sector? And, you know, his sort of standard response in seminars and presentations is that there is some indication that there is some traction from a minimum wage in this sector, despite the obvious lack of compliance against what is he considers largely a negative story about wages in the post-apartheid period.
Okay, thank you. And okay.
I wanted to also question about export that you raised, about the rising export. And I think it's important because it is, you know, maybe counterintuitive. And I try to explain. We have, I mean, the trade sector is, in the model, is very, you know, unique in a sense, because your export is a function of demand, mainly demand from outside, and then obviously the competitiveness in terms of trade. All the scenarios, the demand is given. So the demand is not changing. All the foreign demand stay the same. So the only thing that your export can change in the, you know, in terms of outcomes is the competitiveness of the price effect. And what I said about the price in South Africa, what we have in the scenarios, because of the productivity increase, our estimated price equation, the 45 estimated price that we have, they all mostly are also function of productivity. Increase in labor productivity, reduce prices. And I think it's actually, there is not a huge disagreement on that. So in the model, we're capturing prices going down, which means increases South African productivity, because import prices is also given for all the scenarios. Import prices are not adjusting. So you have a terms of trade that is adjusting in the benefit of South Africa because of rising productivity. Output demand is given. So that is how you see the export showing increase. But if you allow other things to, because we have to compare apple with apple, we compare scenarios, we keep certain things constant and others, you know, moving, comparing scenarios. On the import side is different. We are the demanding side of it, and so both the demand is siding and affecting, and also the terms of trade changing. And therefore, our income increases, which increases demand and consumption and imports, and also relative prices that are partly helping us, but at the same time, we are, you know, we are importing more because of the high income. So that is the trade explanation discussion that I had.
Okay.
Otherwise, if we say
Okay,
that general
I think we should
discussion is become problematic if we say, well, it's a, you know,
Edgar,
common sense.
I think maybe this conversation can take place over some wine after after 5. So I want to move on and just give others a chance to ask a question. Okay. Sorry.
I'm Rita Maize from BDFM. Throughout our discussions, it's just a pity that Nedlek won't be joining us tomorrow. But I'm sure through all the findings and the modelings, there is a presumed wage level that you all believe would work. And the question is open to anyone who is able to have input. What is that wage level that is presumed would work for South Africa, such that it's not, doesn't have the adverse effects that a minimum wage would have? And my follow-up question, maybe I missed it. So should we have a minimum wage and then we have sectorial wages on top of that? Because I'm assuming that we can't have a flat wage and then have different sectors paying their workers that same wage level. Thank you.
Okay. One there, and then we've got a hand on the right and in the front.
Hi, my name is Achievement. I've been going through this document of which you pointed out that the fundamental mandate for the introduction of the minimum wage is to reduce poverty and inequality. And I'm going to reflect on the entire, session actually. You've been coming up with the comparative analysis and case studies from different countries. But I think you have limited yourself into providing us with the research of the countries that are not and currently implementing the minimum wages, such as Sweden, Switzerland, Iceland. I'm mentioning these countries because they also have the highest GDP per capita, the most equal societies. Bearing in mind that the mandate of the introduction of the minimum wage is to reduce poverty and inequality. Wouldn't it have been much more comprehensive for you to do these comparative studies where you say, these are the countries that are implementing minimum wages, but again, these are the countries that are not implementing minimum wages, yet they are still doing all right in terms of the standard of living for the ordinary citizens in those countries. And the next question is, personally, I mean, I just want to ask, is the introduction of the minimum wage in South Africa not going to impair on job creation, given the fact that 55% of the South African labor force is being employed by the SMEs? Though we might have a lot of multinational companies, but we must also be aware that they are not responsible for the employment of the majority of South Africans. So have you done some analysis as to whether the small business sector will be able or to copy or to be adherent into any legislated minimum wage rate that you guys are going to come up with? And the last one is, in most cases, I mean, this is just an advice actually to Vet University, our well-renowned, world-class university, that when you do symposium or discussions such as this, I think it will be much more better to have both parties represented than to listen to more than 7 presentations advocating for one particular subject. Because at the end of the day, we need to hear different views coming from different, intellectuals. So I think it would be much more nicer in future to have someone say, maybe, for example, Thomas Sowell, and say, okay, and for us as the spectators, we are able to reflect and to digest on the different views coming from the panelists. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more people, and hopefully they'll have 1 question each. Okay, there was 1 hand on that side, and then at the front.
Hello, my name is Ben. I'm from the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. My question centers around modeling in this current debate that we're having. You see the model that Gilad presents, saying that there will be literally no or very, very little disemployment effects. We have the model that Asghar is presenting with larger disemployment impacts. We have the Treasury model, which does CGE modeling that projects even larger disemployment impacts. And so I guess my question is around, which model is the right model? How do you defend your model, and why is it better than these other models? And the sense, especially in South Africa, and the need for legislation, whatever it be, to be able to help in the area of poverty, are we spending too much time focusing on the modeling rather than focusing on how to implement something and then change it as you go, citing Brian Levy's work as kind of, as he talks about it, as kind of, South Africa has been known to aim, and then shoot with policy. Should we be shooting and aiming, and if we miss, continue to pick up the pieces as we go, because there's such a big portion of the population that is in poverty, we don't have enough time to continue this analysis. We must move forward as fast as we can and kind of define our own way as we go.
Okay, so I'm going to take one more question at the front, and then we'll get responses.
Thanks. Neil Coleman from the NEDLAC Wage Inequality Task Team. Just to emphasize that the NEDLAC social partners, some of them are here. Labour and community are here. People who've chosen not to be here have made their own choice. And that's extremely, extremely unfortunate. I wanted to ask Asghar, in relation to the statement that was made that in your model, employment declines. Is that in fact correct? Does employment go down or does it increase in the model with the introduction of the national minimum wage? And can you distinguish that from the marginal rise in unemployment? Secondly, can you say something about the quality of the employment that's created in that period? And thirdly, in relation to Gilad's earlier input about the wage share, have you calculated what the impact would be on the wage share? If not, is that something that can be done moving forward? And finally, the question that Roxana and the other international speakers have spoken about, which is the well-documented ripple effect of wages being improved, up, particularly in the lower half of the wage structure. Has that been considered in the model, or have you only modeled it at that level of the national minimum that's introduced? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So the first question was around what would the level be and whether or not there's an adverse effect associated with that. Arden, do you want to respond?
Okay, cool. I'll answer some of the questions that I think are relevant to my presentation. Leading off that, what should the minimum wage be? What number do I have in mind? I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to just tell you that my role in this, or the way I see my role in this debate, and the way a lot of the actors at the moment see the role is not to say we think the national minimum wage should be this. It's just to basically provide some bounds and say, if it's set at this bound, this is who it would affect this, and then moving to Asghar's model of what would happen to various parts of the economy. So it's up to government, labour, business, and civil society in the hallowed halls of NEDLAC to make the actual decision. And I think part of this debate is to try and contextualize things and say, these are the bounds, these are the possible effects, rather than saying, the point of this interaction is not to zoom in and get a particular number, at least in this particular context. The second question about job creation, I mean, as was said earlier this morning, I mean, the effect on employment depends, of course, where the national minimum wage is set. If it's set incredibly low, of course, we'll have a very different impact on employment to if it's set incredibly high. And I think Asghar's model was useful in terms of looking at the feed through for various scenarios. So, I mean, of course, probably the central question that is concerning policymakers and modelers is what will happen to employment. And again, like all good questions, the answer is it depends. And then finally, I guess Gilad has dealt a little bit with why certain actors and certain sides of the debate are not represented here. Neil also alluded to it, but just to add my 2 cents, I'm not sure Mike Schuessler would want to be photographed in this room, although it is very disappointing that we do not have more representatives from other parts of the debate here, as Neil said. I think that sort of covers even tangentially what was related to my presentation. So, Asghar, do you want to
try to be quick? In terms of the question about what wage level, I don't have the answer to that, but I didn't get to, of the scenarios that we run, the maximal scenario actually, in the paper we discuss it, it causes a good amount of, not that it doesn't generate results or in some indicators are higher than others, but it is create a lot of volatility in number of indicators. So what we have concluded about that scenario is that 6,000, starting 6,000 up seems like to be a level that it makes some of the variables, some of the indicators are too volatile relative to the other scenarios that we have. But the rest of them do not, the other scenarios that we run we did not have that problem. In terms of the question about which model to use, what is a better model, I indicated one criteria or one thing for this project, I said, is that we got to look at models that are looking at production, expenditure or demand, and distribution. How does each model, capture these, the different sides of the economy and interrelationship or dynamic between it? Do they capture it, or are they one-sided? Are they making assumptions about one of them and the other? For example, in the ILO model, for example, the average wage or the wage share is given, is exogenous. While in modeling, usually obviously distribution of income is a contested ground. It comes from production. It comes from labor demand, and that process will decide about the employment and the wage together with the GDP that determines it. So to have it exogenous, it has its own limitations. Similarly with the CG. So those three things about production, distribution, and expenditure, how the model deals with that, I think is a good thing to use. In terms of, we spend too much on analyzing, I agree, sometimes we do, but that's the nature of the beast, I guess. In terms of the, Neil, I think the question, I think it is wrong, in my view, to look at the national minimum wage to see how does it affect employment as it's determining whether we should have a national minimum wage or not. First, it does, the whole morning we discussed it, all international evidence of countries shows it has either minimal or negligent or no effect. And what we have actually here is the similar. And what we were presented also from Harun Borat's team, also in some of the studies for effects on is also small or negligent. And what we have, for example, from POW and Labyrinth, study that was done on the minimum wage, when you take the household effect out, the workers, where they actually say that the 200,000 that they used, will find out that afterward, when they did the ex post study, domestic workers were not affected, it ends up with like 50, 60,000 or so negative effect. So the key is where this morning started. The national minimum wage is about affecting poverty and distribution. It is not a solution for employment. It's been said several times. It's not a silver bullet that we can get both poverty, inequality, employment, growth, all of them through national minimum wage. That would have been fantastic, but there is no such luck. We're not going to have that. So the aim, I think we got to look at keep our eye on the ball and looking at its poverty distribution, analyze it, and is that effective to achieve its objective? That is the target for that policy, and that's, in terms of Neil, your questions, in terms of the employment effects, we have it on the, these are the small numbers. The service sector employment that goes down is because of 2 out of 8 sectors in the service sector. These are building construction and wholesale and retail, catering and accommodation. Those are the 2. The other sectors actually employment gains, small gains, but positive. Only those 2 subsectors in service, there is a negative effect on it, and that makes the service sector employment negative, and therefore what we see show. Overall, the total economy-wide effect is, as I mentioned, is about 40,000, between 16 to 40,000. And it means relative to the base scenario. Employment is increasing. It's just when we say relative to the base scenario, this is the decline. It is not like from where we're starting right now, employment is going to be going down. No, it is relative to the base scenario growth path of employment. This is in comparison. I hope I answered that question.
I'll just go briefly, since I know there are other questions. I didn't think either of the other panelists would pick the minimum wage level either. I'm not going to. I think the more interesting thing is how do we come up with that? And as one of the audience members suggested, there is a sense of urgency. Half the population's in poverty, but moreover, a large percentage of workers are in poverty and have been for some time. We haven't seen the progress we would have expected among the employed in terms of poverty. But in many ways, given that urgency, maybe what we're actually talking about is what the starting point is on a national minimum wage. And what should come out of this type of symposium and the previous one is how we go about getting to that appropriate level. In terms of job destruction, I mean, I think really the task set before us by the first two presentations was find a level that has some sort of traction and bind, which has a measurable impact on poverty and inequality, but not one so high that destroys jobs. So that's what we're actually looking for, and that's part of the process. So it's very difficult to sort of say, will a national minimum wage destroy jobs? It's the process of finding a national minimum wage which fits the right spot for our economy, and it's not meant to be an easy task, which is why I think people would hope that all parties would come to discuss that, so we have the best information available. Just the last question that I have that we haven't addressed is, why do the cross-country studies not look at countries like Sweden and Iceland, which are highly equal yet don't have a minimum wage? I can't speak for those authors. I wasn't involved in any of those studies. But I think it was really about the goal of the research, which is looking what happens in countries where a minimum wage is implemented. From a research point of view, it's very difficult to research something that hasn't happened. Modeling is difficult enough without putting in hypotheticals for something, sort of trying to guess at a counterfactual.
Okay, thank you. We've got time, I think, for one more round. There's a hand right at the back. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Papin Kodi again. My question really is very simple. We have been saying that the setting of the national minimum wage should be evidence-based. I do know for a fact that the national minimum wage will be national policy. There is no question about that. However, the question is, are we as researchers, as the civil society, as business representatives, and from all the spheres and stationing of lives that we come from, are we evidence ready? I think that's what Ben was asking earlier. Are we evidence ready? Because the moment that NEDLAC decides that no, this is where we are going to be heading, one of the first things that's going to be asked is the baseline data and statistics. Do we have those? I don't think so. Because this thing is going to happen, whether we like it or not, it is going to happen. We may stop our heads regarding at what level is it set, at 4,005, at 2,002, or 1,258, whatever the figure is. But how do we then improve from wherever it's going to be and actually be able to measure its influence on various aspects of life? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Ben from UCT. I have a question, last question on modeling again. We've heard from some of the presenters and certainly from the work I've seen internationally that there seems to be a suggestion that the employment effects of a minimum wage are negligible or non-existent when there's a kind of marginal increase in the minimum wage. But we don't really know what happens when there's a large increase. I'm wondering if at any point in your model there's a kind of turning point where you find that actually the increases are too large and you do get big employment effects. Is that the case, or do you just keep on getting kind of positive spillovers until wherever?
Okay, thank you. Question on the right.
Hi, it's Shane Godfrey from Cape Town. I think Arden's the only person in all the presentations that's quite clearly indicated when he was talking about his data that for him employment meant 35 hours plus per week. Everyone else has spoken about employment, I assume, and unemployment in the way that it's defined internationally, which is 8 hours of work a week. Is that the way people were talking about employment? Because if you are, then it means that there's potential for the minimum wage to have a massive impact on the composition of the labor market, the way that work is structured within the labor market, between 40 hours or 42 hours a week and 8 hours a week, without affecting employment. You could have a massive impact on aggregate hours worked in the labor market and the types of jobs in the labor market. And so I'd be interesting to hear your response to that and whether that's been factored into your models. And also just the other side of that coin is that this morning also, in all the studies, no one spoke about, when they were talking about national minimum wages in those countries, spoke about whether that national minimum wage was set at an hourly rate, a daily rate, a weekly rate, or a monthly rate, which surely has significant implications for how that plays out in the labor market and what will happen to employment and to poverty and the composition of work within the household. And I was wondering whether there have been any studies that have looked comparatively at minimum wages that were introduced with, according to payment for different time periods, an hourly rate compared to, say, a weekly rate, and how the impact then is on dependent variables like employment, however you define it, household poverty, and so on. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can take the last question. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Alfred. I'm from COSATU. Just to clear the confusion that I have, because I want to be practical about this. There was the mention of sectoral determination. So I want to know, I think it's Ben who mentioned it, and Gilad. I want to know, are we considering the sectoral determination as a form of minimum wage? Because my understanding is that the sectoral determinations are only covering the vulnerable sectors where the minister unilaterally sets those as a minimum floor. Now, the national minimum wage, I don't think is going to be regionally sensitive as sectoral determinations are. Secondly, well, the presentations all day presented here, I think they show or they say what labor would actually like to hear, that national minimum wage is possible. It can be implemented. But I've not heard anyone or any evidence put here to say that, look, national minimum wage is not possible, or maybe what business would the position they would argue in terms of you know, the falling, the unemployment, that we will lose jobs, the capital flight, etc., etc. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand over to the panel. Asghar, maybe we should start with you. I think you did respond to the question about when increases become too large, so maybe just clarify that.
In terms of that, the question you raised, I haven't run a whole range of sensitivities to give you a precise answer to that. What we found, we run 4 scenarios, and the 4th scenario, as I mentioned earlier, causes a number of increased volatility in number of indicators for that at the macro level. So we concluded from that that is where it is, you know, it is not a suitable level of. But in terms of the other 3 scenarios that we have run, which basically shocks the average real wage rate of sectors between 0 and 1.8, 1.9%. And that's important in terms of how much, at the end of the day, how much does it affect the sectors and at what level. That level, we don't find that unstable. There is no instability in the outcome of this. So when the scenarios of the wage scenario, national minimum wage scenario, we calculated, it is lead to between 0 and 2% almost average wage rate, sectoral average wage rate shocks. But I think it's a good question in terms of looking into it. It just hasn't been part of the study, and we haven't had time to look at it from there, that perspective. But there are other, like for example, on that 6,000 one, there are a number of indicators that you look at and you realize it is a red flag, and you realize that that wage rate is creating problem, and mainly because of its impact on rate of profit. When it goes too high, it affects rate of profit, it affects investment, and the first thing you see is that investment become volatile, and then it has, it has other ripple effects in the economy as well.
Okay. No.
I mean, I think every question was directed to Asghar, so I'll cede my time to him if he wants to deal more with the...
There was just one question around employment, what metric used for full-time employment, and whether there's any change in effect from increasing per hourly wages versus per monthly wages for
the full-time, actually Arden is the one who, the time series we have for employment underlying the model includes full-time and part-time and also informal workers. So it's total employment by the sector from 1970, the time series that we have. In terms of when we were looking at the national minimum wage scenario, it was designed for the full-time workers. So we calculated that Arden broke down each of the 45 sectors that we have in the model into 8 segments. And looking at it from 2014, the labor survey, employment survey, right? Labor market analysis. See how each sector, the different segments, those who making less than 25% of the average wage rate, those making less than 40%, and creating 8 brackets of average wages and share of employment in age. So we use that for full-time employee. We use that in order to write the program to calculate the magnitude of shocks to each sector due to the national minimum wage. So maybe it doesn't come out as clear, but but the model in terms of the overall employment projection that we have in the model is for total employment, including the formal and informal part. So it matches with like total employment that we get with labor force survey, for example, 15 million or 14.5 million, whatever. That's what our database is based on.
Okay, Mike, do you have any closing comments?
Maybe just the question, are we evidence ready in South Africa? Can we sort of pull the trigger? I think that's interesting, but it also really depends on who you ask. And maybe the people on stage are the last people to ask, when are we evidence ready? Because we're never really evidence ready. That's the nature of research, is always asking more questions and refining. So what I think the real question, though, is what sort of mechanism do we use going forward? And that's why I thought some of the presentations for how things are discussed and debated and decided in the UK might be important. There's a huge role for research, but it also has to be sort of put into context for other ways of making decisions, getting independent sort of bodies or committees to decide these things. And it's really about how research sort of feeds into the process of identifying where the minimum wage might be. So research can sort of go so far, but we need, I think, a broader process to decide when we are evidence ready, when we do know that we can do something. Yeah, I think it depends on which actors you ask if we're evidence ready.
Okay, thank you. Just 2 things from my side. I did want to mention that the questions around enforcement, if you're feeling like they haven't really been answered, there's a panel on that tomorrow, so come back. And then I wanted to hand over to Gilad, who's going to close the session. But before we do that, I just wanted to thank the panel. I think it was a really fruitful discussion, and thank you very much for coming.